The weight of the rope. The rope hung over the cliff edge like a lifeline to hell, its hemp fibers already darkened with morning dew and something else that caught the light wrong. Desmond Doss tested the anchor knots one more time, his hands trembling not from cold, but from the weight of what lay ahead. Below him, 60 feet down the sheer coral face of Hacksaw Ridge, medics and stretcher-bearers clustered in whatever shelter they could find, their faces turned upward with expressions he couldn't quite read from this distance. The dawn assault on Okinawa's most heavily fortified position had begun 3 hours ago with the confident precision of a textbook operation. 2 companies of the 77th Infantry Division had climbed the cargo nets and scaling ladders, reaching the plateau just as the sun broke over the Pacific. The plan had been simple: establish a foothold, suppress the Japanese cave positions, and push inland before the enemy could organize effective resistance. Instead, Doss now found himself alone on a ridge that looked like the surface of a dead planet. The plateau stretched behind him in all directions, a moonscape of shell craters and scattered equipment. Helmets lay overturned next to torn medical pouches, their contents spilled across the coral rock. Somewhere in that chaos, wounded men were calling his name with voices that grew weaker each time he heard them. The sound cut through the intermittent crack of sniper fire and the distant rumble of mortars, a human thread connecting him to choices he wasn't sure he was strong enough to make. Private Johnson lay in the nearest shell crater, conscious but pale, his left leg bent at an angle that made Doss's stomach clench. Sergeant Chen had crawled behind a blasted tree stump 200 yards across the plateau, leaving a trail in the coral dust that told its own story. Corporal Williams hadn't moved from the position where shrapnel had found him, though Doss could still see his chest rising and falling in the erratic rhythm of shock. The retreat order had crackled through the radio at 09:30 hours, delivered in the clipped tone of a company commander who had watched his careful plans dissolve into bloody confusion. Fall back to the base of the ridge. Regroup. Wait for artillery support. Standard tactical doctrine when an assault met unexpected resistance. The surviving troops had rappelled down the cliff face with the practiced efficiency of men who had climbed too many ridges, leaving their wounded behind, not from callousness, but from simple mathematics. It was impossible to carry stretcher cases down a vertical rock face under fire. Doss checked his medical kit for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. Morphine, sulfur powder, field dressings, tourniquets, the basic tools of a trade that suddenly felt inadequate against the scale of suffering scattered across the ridge. His uniform hung in tatters already, torn by coral and blackened with other men's blood. The red cross painted on his helmet felt like both protection and target, a symbol that meant everything and nothing depending on which end of a rifle you occupied. "Doss, you hear me?" The voice belonged to Lieutenant Morrison, calling from somewhere below the cliff edge. "Orders are to fall back." "That's not a suggestion." The rope shifted slightly in Doss's hands, rough hemp that would either hold a man's weight or send him tumbling to the rocks below. He had rigged it using techniques learned in basic training and improvised desperation, anchoring the line to the twisted remains of a Japanese artillery piece. Each knot had been tied with hands that shook from exhaustion and the constant crack of rifle fire echoing off the coral walls. "I hear you, sir," Doss called back, his voice carrying across the space between what was ordered and what was necessary. "Just need to check on something up here." It was a lie, and they both knew it. There was nothing to check except the 17 wounded soldiers he had already counted, men who would die if someone didn't go back for them. While tactical doctrine demanded retreat and regrouping, Doss found himself measuring the distance to the nearest wounded man against the time it would take snipers to adjust their aim. The mathematics of courage had always been beyond his understanding, but the mathematics of leaving good men to die was simple arithmetic he couldn't accept. A mortar shell exploded 40 yards to his left, showering him with fragments of coral and earth. The concussion made his ears ring and reminded him that the Japanese positions carved into the cliff face remained very much active. Machine gun bursts echoed across the plateau in irregular patterns, forcing him to time his movements between the firing sequences. He had no weapon to return fire, no way to suppress the enemy guns that tracked movement across the open ground. Only speed, prayer, and an intimate knowledge of every crater and shell hole that offered momentary shelter. The rope coiled beside him like a serpent, already stained and frayed in 3 places where it had scraped against the coral edge during the morning's evacuation. Doss knew it couldn't hold much longer, knew his own strength was nearly spent. Yet he couldn't reconcile retreat with the sound of wounded men crying in the distance. The weight of their voices pulled at something deeper than military discipline or personal survival. He whispered the prayer that had carried him through basic training, through the long voyage across the Pacific, through every moment when following orders conflicted with following conscience. Please, Lord, help me get one more. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. Private Martinez hung unconscious in the makeshift harness, blood seeping through field dressings that had been white an hour ago. The descent down Hacksaw Ridge's 60-foot cliff face required 20 minutes of careful rope work, with Doss controlling every foot of line through a metal ring salvaged from a destroyed stretcher. His palms burned where the hemp cut into flesh already raw from previous trips, and twice he had to stop when sniper bullets cracked past his head, sending sparks off the coral face inches from the rope. This was the 7th wounded soldier he had lowered to safety since the retreat order came through. Each trip across the exposed plateau had been a separate negotiation between speed and stealth, timing movements to the irregular pattern of machine gun bursts that echoed from cave positions carved deep into the coral. The Japanese defenders had turned Okinawa's limestone ridges into fortress walls, creating overlapping fields of fire that caught advancing troops in devastating crossfire. What looked like empty caves from a distance revealed themselves as carefully positioned gun emplacements once American soldiers reached the plateau above. The 77th Infantry Division had trained for amphibious assault and jungle fighting, but Hacksaw Ridge presented a different kind of warfare entirely. The coral formation rose nearly vertical from the Okinawan countryside, its top offering no cover except what artillery had blasted into the rock. Approaching the Japanese positions meant crossing open ground under observation, while retreating required rappelling down a cliff face that channeled men into predictable descent routes. It was terrain that favored defenders who had months to prepare positions and sight their weapons. Martinez stirred halfway down, eyes wide with terror as he spun slowly in the harness suspended above the rocky slope. Doss called down encouragement while fighting his own vertigo, muscles screaming as he controlled the rope's feed through hands that barely functioned anymore. The young private had taken shrapnel in the abdomen and leg during the morning assault, crawling nearly 200 yards across the plateau before collapsing in a shell crater filled with rainwater, turned red. Easy there, Martinez. Almost down. The medics are waiting. Below them, Doctor. Stevenson and 2 orderlies clustered around a makeshift aid station established in the shelter of overhanging rock. They had been catching wounded soldiers lowered from above for hours now, performing triage with supplies that dwindled with each new arrival. The doctor's fatigues were stained to the elbows, his movements carrying the mechanical efficiency of a man who had learned to work without thinking too deeply about faces or names. When Martinez finally reached the medics, Doss collapsed against the coral outcropping that served as his anchor point. His chest heaved as he fought to catch his breath, vision blurring from exhaustion and the constant strain of controlling rope descents. Sweat mixed with coral dust on his face, and he could taste salt and fear on his lips. The makeshift harness had held again, but the rope showed new areas of fraying where it had scraped against sharp edges during the descent. "Doss!" Lieutenant Morrison's voice carried up from below, sharp with frustration and something that might have been concern. "That's 7 men. Whatever you think you're proving up there, you've done enough." But Sergeant Chen was still trapped in his crater, semi-conscious and losing blood from abdominal wounds. Corporal Williams lay motionless behind the burned tree stump, breathing in the shallow gasps that meant shock was setting in. Private Johnson had stopped calling for help 20 minutes ago, which could mean he had lost consciousness or something worse. The sound of wounded men crying in the distance had become a constant background to the crack of rifle fire and the whistle of mortar fragments. Doss checked the rope again, running it through his torn hands to locate the weak spots. The hemp fibers had stretched and separated under repeated stress, creating thin sections that wouldn't support much more weight. Elementary physics suggested it would fail soon, probably during the next descent, possibly sending both rescuer and rescued tumbling to the rocks below. Basic military doctrine suggested he had already exceeded any reasonable definition of duty, that continuing would constitute reckless endangerment of his own life without significantly improving tactical outcomes. The mathematics of courage remained beyond his understanding, but the mathematics of abandoning wounded men was still simple arithmetic he couldn't accept. A machine gun burst raked across the plateau, sending bullets sparking off coral outcroppings 30 yards from his position. The Japanese gunners had learned to anticipate his movements, adjusting their fire patterns each time he crossed the open ground. They probably had spotters calling out his position, maybe even betting on how long one unarmed American medic could continue moving between their carefully sighted kill zones. The thought should have been terrifying, but exhaustion had numbed most emotions, except the stubborn certainty that leaving meant condemning good men to die. He whispered his prayer again, checking the knots that anchored the rope to the twisted artillery piece. The metal was solid, but the rope itself told a different story in frayed hemp and dark stains. "Please, Lord, help me get one more." Corporal Williams hadn't moved in 15 minutes. His breathing looked shallower from this distance, irregular in a way that suggested time was running out. The burned tree stump that provided his cover was 200 yards across the plateau, through overlapping fields of machine gun fire and within range of at least 3 sniper positions. Getting there would require crossing ground that offered no concealment except speed and prayer. Doss stood slowly, testing his balance against the vertigo that came with exhaustion and blood loss from his own minor wounds. His medical kit felt heavier than it should, weighted with supplies that seemed inadequate against the scale of suffering scattered across Hacksaw Ridge. The red cross on his helmet caught morning sunlight, a symbol that meant everything and nothing, depending on which side of the war you occupied. The rope coiled beside him like a question mark, frayed and blood-stained, but still capable of supporting one more descent. Maybe 2 if he was careful with the weak sections. Certainly not enough for all the wounded men who remained scattered across the plateau, but possibly enough for the ones who couldn't wait much longer. The coral dust had settled into everything. Uniform, boots, the creases around Doss's eyes where sweat had carved channels through the grime. He moved in short sprints across the plateau, diving for cover as mortars began walking across the ridge in thunderous explosions that showered him with debris. Each shell detonated closer than the last, suggesting Japanese spotters had finally pinpointed his movement pattern and were adjusting fire accordingly. The 77th Infantry Division's maps had marked most of the cave positions, but they hadn't captured the methodical patience of defenders who had spent months learning every sightline and range marker on Hacksaw Ridge. Corporal Williams lay semi-conscious in the shadow of the blasted tree stump, his left arm mangled by shrapnel that had torn through muscle and bone. The bandages Doss applied with trembling hands quickly soaked through, revealing wounds that required surgical attention far beyond anything available on a contested plateau. Williams drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes gripping Doss's arm with surprising strength, sometimes lying still as death while mortar's fragments whistled overhead. "Can't feel my fingers," Williams whispered, his voice barely audible over the constant crack of rifle fire. "Can't feel my hand at all." Doss administered morphine from his dwindling supply, checking Williams' pupils for signs of concussion while machine gun bursts raked positions 50 yards to their left. The corporal's breathing had stabilized somewhat, but shock was setting in. The pale complexion and clammy skin that meant his body was shutting down non-essential systems to preserve core functions. Moving him would require improvisation born of desperation, since the rope couldn't support another full descent, and Williams couldn't walk to the cliff edge on his own. Getting back to the cliff required a different kind of courage than the initial rescue. Williams was conscious enough to understand their situation, aware that movement across open ground would draw concentrated fire from positions that had been tracking Doss's activities all morning. The corporal tried to protest, mumbling that he wasn't worth the risk, that orders were orders and good soldiers followed them. Doss ignored him, fashioning a travois from rifle stocks and canvas shelter halves that would allow him to drag Williams across the crater-pocked terrain in stages. "You're coming with me, Corporal. No discussion." Each movement forward demanded careful timing, wait for the machine gun to shift targets, sprint during the gap between mortar rounds, freeze when footsteps echoed from cave positions that seemed too close. Williams gripped the canvas sides of the improvised stretcher, his face grey with pain and the effort of staying conscious. The travois bumped and scraped across coral outcroppings, catching on debris and requiring constant adjustment as they worked their way toward the cliff edge. Halfway across the plateau, radio static crackled from a discarded communications pack. Fragments of conversation reached them between bursts of interference. Casualty reports from other units, requests for artillery support, the controlled chaos of a regimental command post trying to coordinate multiple assaults across Okinawa's fortified ridges. The voices carried the tension of officers who had discovered that intelligence estimates about Japanese defensive preparations had been optimistically low. Charlie Company reports heavy resistance at Grid 247. Need immediate medical evacuation, estimated 30% casualties. The numbers hit Doss like physical blows. 30% casualties meant that other units were experiencing the same devastating crossfire that had turned the assault on Hacksaw Ridge into a rescue operation. Across Okinawa, medics were making the same impossible choices between following retreat orders and abandoning wounded men who couldn't reach safety on their own. The radio voices spoke in the careful language of military efficiency, but underneath the tactical terminology lay the same arithmetic of courage that Doss couldn't reconcile. Williams lost consciousness during the final approach to the cliff edge, his breathing becoming shallow and irregular. Doss checked his pulse, weak but steady, and applied fresh bandages to the worst bleeding. The travois had held together despite scraping across coral and taking impacts from flying debris, but Williams needed surgical attention that wouldn't be available until he reached the aid station below. The rope that would carry him down the cliff face showed new areas of fraying, hemp fibers separated by repeated stress and sharp edges. At the cliff edge, Dr. Stevenson's voice carried up from the aid station below, professional but tinged with something that might have been desperation. "Doss, we're running low on plasma and morphine down here. How many more are you bringing down?" It was a reasonable question from a medical officer trying to manage limited supplies, but it forced Doss to confront mathematics he had been avoiding. Sergeant Chen still lay trapped in his crater, semi-conscious and losing blood from abdominal wounds. Private Johnson hadn't been heard from in over an hour, which could mean unconsciousness, death, or capture. At least 3 other wounded soldiers remained scattered across positions too distant to reach before the rope failed completely. The hemp line coiled beside Williams' improvised stretcher, stained with blood and frayed nearly through in multiple places. Elementary physics suggested it would support one more descent, possibly two, if the weak sections didn't coincide with maximum stress points during the lowering process. After that, the mathematical certainties of tensile strength and weight distribution would make further rescue attempts impossible without fresh equipment that wasn't available. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Williams stirred as Doss rigged the harness around his chest and shoulders, checking knots that would either hold a man's weight or fail catastrophically. The corporal's eyes opened briefly, focusing on Doss's face with an expression of gratitude mixed with confusion about why anyone would risk this much for a soldier who couldn't contribute to the tactical situation. "Why?" Williams whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind that swept across Hacksaw Ridge from the Pacific. Doss tested the anchor knots one more time, his hands trembling from exhaustion and the weight of choices that extended far beyond military doctrine. The prayer that had sustained him through basic training and across the Pacific felt inadequate against the scale of suffering scattered across the plateau, but it was the only tool he possessed for reconciling orders with conscience. "Please, Lord, help me get one more." The rope cut deeper into Doss's palms with each foot of Williams' descent, hemp fibers separating under stress that exceeded their designed capacity. 60 feet down the coral face of Hacksaw Ridge, Dr. Stevenson and his orderlies waited with expressions that mixed professional readiness with growing concern about the lone figure moving across the plateau above. They had been receiving wounded soldiers from an impossible source for hours now, watching one unarmed medic appear and disappear in the smoke like a ghost who refused to accept tactical reality. Williams reached the aid station semi-conscious, but alive, his breathing stabilized enough for the surgical attention his wounds required. Doss collapsed against the coral outcropping that served as his anchor point, vision tunneling with exhaustion and blood loss from cuts on his hands that had reopened during the descent. The 77th Infantry Division's assault on Okinawa's most heavily fortified position had devolved into a rescue operation that defied every principle of military doctrine, yet somehow continued because one man couldn't reconcile retreat with abandoning wounded soldiers. 8 men lowered to safety. The arithmetic should have felt like victory, but Sergeant Chen remained trapped in his crater 200 yards across the plateau, semi-conscious and losing blood from shrapnel wounds that required immediate attention. Private Johnson hadn't been heard from in over an hour, which meant unconsciousness, capture, or death, possibilities that demanded investigation regardless of tactical considerations. The rope that connected rescue to impossibility showed new areas of fraying that would limit its capacity to support additional descents. Lieutenant Morrison's voice carried up from below, sharp with frustration and mounting concern for a medic who had exceeded any reasonable definition of duty hours ago. "Doss, you've done enough. That's 8 men who wouldn't have made it without you. Don't throw your life away for numbers you can't change." It was sound, tactical advice from an officer who understood that individual heroism couldn't alter strategic outcomes. But Doss found himself unable to accept mathematics that wrote off wounded soldiers as acceptable losses. The Japanese defenders had turned Hacksaw Ridge into a killing ground that favored patient marksmanship over rapid movement, creating overlapping fields of fire that caught American troops in devastating crossfire. Retreating meant acknowledging tactical failure, while continuing meant accepting risks that bordered on suicide. The rope coiled beside him like a question about the difference between courage and foolishness. Its hemp fibers darkened with blood and stretched beyond safe working limits. Doss ran it through his torn hands, locating weak spots that would fail under stress. Elementary physics suggested one more descent, possibly 2 if the weight distribution avoided the most damaged sections. After that, the laws of tensile strength would make further rescue attempts impossible without fresh equipment that wasn't available. Chen lay in his crater like a test of principles that extended beyond military doctrine. Getting there would require crossing 200 yards of open ground under observation from cave positions that had been tracking Doss's movements all morning. Japanese gunners had learned to anticipate his routes, adjusting fire patterns each time he appeared in their carefully sighted kill zones. They probably had spotters calling out his position, maybe even wagering on how long one American medic could continue operating in terrain that belonged to defenders who had spent months preparing positions. The mathematics of courage remained beyond understanding, but the mathematics of leaving Chen to die was simple arithmetic that violated everything Doss had carried into this war. He moved across the plateau in short sprints, timing movements to the irregular pattern of machine gun bursts that echoed from limestone caves carved deep into Hacksaw Ridge. Mortars began falling in a steady pattern, walking across the coral terrain in thunderous explosions that suggested Japanese observers had finally coordinated indirect fire to suppress his activities. Each shell detonated closer than the last, showering him with debris and reminding him that enemy patience had limits. Chen was semi-conscious when Doss found him, lying in rainwater turned red by blood seeping from abdominal wounds. The sergeant's breathing came in shallow gasps, his uniform torn away to reveal shrapnel damage that required surgical attention far beyond anything available on a contested plateau. Doss applied pressure bandages with hands that barely functioned, administering morphine while mortar fragments whistled overhead and machine gun bursts raked positions 50 yards away. "Medic," Chen whispered, his eyes focusing on Doss's face with an expression of disbelief mixed with gratitude. "Thought everyone left?" "Nobody gets left behind, Sergeant. That's not how this works." Getting Chen back to the cliff edge required the same improvised travois that had worked for Williams, rifle stocks and canvas shelter halves that would allow movement across crater-pocked terrain without exposing both men to concentrated fire. Chen drifted in and out of consciousness as they worked their way between shell holes and coral outcroppings, sometimes gripping the canvas sides of the stretcher with surprising strength, sometimes lying still as death while enemy fire adjusted to track their movement. At the cliff edge, the rope showed new areas of separation, where hemp fibers had stretched beyond their capacity to maintain structural integrity. Doss rigged the harness around Chen's chest and shoulders, checking knots that would either hold or fail catastrophically during the 60-foot descent to the aid station below. His hands shook with exhaustion and blood loss, but the anchor points remained solid. Japanese artillery twisted into service as salvation for American wounded. The descent took 30 minutes of careful rope work, with Doss controlling every foot of line through a metal ring that had become hot from friction. Chen spun slowly in the harness, suspended above rocky slopes, while sniper bullets cracked past close enough to feel the displacement. Twice, Doss had to stop when machine gun bursts came too close, pressing himself against the coral face while bullets sparked off stone inches from the rope. When Chen finally reached Dr. Stevenson's waiting hands, the rope parted completely, falling in useless coils to the rocks below. Doss sat alone on Hacksaw Ridge as afternoon shadows began stretching across Okinawa, surrounded by the debris of battle, but no longer hearing voices calling for help. The silence felt heavier than gunfire, settling over him like a weight he couldn't name. 9 men lowered to safety. The arithmetic should have represented victory, but Doss found himself unable to celebrate numbers achieved through choices that had pushed luck and equipment beyond reasonable limits. His uniform hung in shreds, his hands required medical attention. His body trembled with the aftermath of adrenaline sustained across impossible hours. The secret that would never appear in official reports was how close Doss had come to breaking during Chen's descent. 30 feet down the coral face of Hacksaw Ridge, with the sergeant spinning unconsciously in a harness rigged from salvaged equipment, The rope had begun separating fiber by fiber under stress that exceeded every safety margin. Doss had felt the hemp stretching in his hands, individual strands snapping with tiny sounds that carried the weight of a man's life. For 17 seconds that stretched into eternity. He had stared at fraying cordage and calculated the mathematical certainty of failure. The prayer that had sustained him through basic training and across the Pacific had become something closer to negotiation during those 17 seconds. Not the confident faith of a young man who believed in divine protection, but the desperate bargaining of someone who had pushed luck and equipment beyond reasonable limits. If the rope failed, Chen would fall 60 feet to the rocks below, and Doss would spend the rest of his life carrying the memory of a rescue attempt that became execution through good intentions. Please, Lord, just hold together long enough. It was a different prayer than the one he had whispered all morning, stripped of certainty and colored by the understanding that individual heroism couldn't suspend the laws of physics indefinitely. The rope had held, barely, but the experience left Doss with knowledge he would never share publicly. Behind every citation for valor lay moments when courage felt indistinguishable from terror, when the line between heroism and catastrophe came down to hemp fibers and luck. Sitting alone on Hacksaw Ridge, as evening approached, Doss found himself confronting arithmetic that extended far beyond the 9 wounded soldiers he had lowered to safety. The 77th Infantry Division's assault on Okinawa's most heavily fortified position had cost approximately 40% casualties, with most losses occurring during the first hour, when carefully planned advances met devastating crossfire from cave positions. His individual actions had rescued 9 men from immediate death, but they couldn't alter strategic outcomes or resurrect the soldiers who had died before he could reach them. The Japanese defenders remained in their limestone caves, machine guns and mortars still covering every approach to the plateau. Tomorrow would bring fresh assaults, new casualties, and the same impossible choices between following orders and following conscience. Doss had proven that one unarmed medic could operate in terrain that belonged to the enemy, but he had also learned the limits of individual action against systematic killing designed by military engineers who understood overlapping fields of fire. Private Johnson was dead. Doss had found his body during the final trip across the plateau, killed by a sniper's bullet that had caught him as he tried to crawl toward the cliff edge. Johnson had died alone, probably calling for help that took too long to arrive, bleeding out in coral dust while rescue operations focused on wounded who seemed more salvageable. The mathematics of triage demanded such choices, but they left Doss with the weight of a young soldier who had trusted that medics would come for him. 2 other wounded men remained missing, either captured, killed, or hidden in positions too remote to reach before darkness made movement across the plateau impossible. Their names would appear in official casualty reports as missing in action, a category that allowed families to maintain hope while acknowledging tactical reality. Doss knew their actual status with the certainty that came from counting voices in the distance and watching them fall silent one by one. The rope that had connected rescue to impossibility lay in broken coils 60 feet below, its hemp fibers finally surrendering to stress that had exceeded design specifications for hours. Elementary physics had prevailed eventually, reminding everyone involved that individual courage couldn't suspend natural laws indefinitely. 9 men had reached safety because the rope held longer than mathematics suggested it should. But the margin between success and catastrophe had been measured in individual fibers and moments of grace. Doctor. Stevenson's voice carried up from the aid station below, professional but colored by exhaustion that came from performing surgery with inadequate supplies under impossible conditions. Doss, we've got Chen stabilized and Williams prepped for evacuation. Johnson didn't make it, but the others are going to see home because of what you did up there. It should have felt like victory, But Doss found himself unable to celebrate arithmetic that balanced 9 lives saved against multiple lives lost, and a tactical situation that remained unchanged. The Japanese defenders had demonstrated that Hacksaw Ridge could be held against determined assault by forces with superior numbers and equipment. Tomorrow would bring fresh attempts to dislodge them, new casualties among soldiers who trusted that medics would come for them when bullets found their mark. The red cross on his helmet caught evening light, a symbol that meant everything and nothing depending on which side of the war you occupied. Enemy snipers had aimed at it all day, some shooting to kill and others perhaps respecting medical neutrality in small ways that might have made the difference between 9 rescues and none. The contradiction felt impossible to resolve. Symbols of healing surrounded by systematic killing, individual compassion operating within organizational violence. When darkness finally made movement across the plateau impossible, Doss began his own descent from Hacksaw Ridge. Not by rope, which lay broken below, but by picking his way down rocky slopes that offered handholds carved by morning artillery. His uniform hung in shreds. His hands required medical attention. His body trembled with aftershocks from adrenaline, sustained across impossible hours. But he carried knowledge that would never appear in official reports. The weight of 17 seconds, when hemp fibers and faith had been tested beyond reasonable limits. The rescue team that reached him after dark found him unconscious beside the cliff edge, one hand still gripping a fragment of the rope that had saved 9 lives. In field hospitals and command posts, officers would record his actions in careful military language that compressed hours of terror and choice into clean sentences suitable for citations. But the rope told a different story. Blood-stained, frayed, stretched beyond any reasonable breaking point, yet somehow holding when holding mattered most. 23 years later, Desmond Doss woke to the sound of rain on his roof in Rising Fawn, Georgia, and for 17 seconds he was back on Hacksaw Ridge with hemp fibers separating in his hands. The nightmare always began the same way. Chen spinning in the harness 30 feet down the coral face, the rope stretching beyond safe working limits, and the mathematical certainty that physics would prevail over prayer. He would wake with his palms burning where cordage had cut into flesh, phantom pain from wounds that had healed decades ago, but never truly faded. His wife found him sitting in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, staring at his hands in the dim light that filtered through curtains. She had learned not to ask about the nightmares directly. Doss rarely spoke about Okinawa in specific terms, preferring the careful language of official citations to the private memory of terror and choice. But she knew the signs. Sleepless nights after thunderstorms, involuntary flinching when ropes or climbing equipment appeared in movies, the way he sometimes paused when passing construction sites where workers rappelled down building faces. The Medal of Honor citation had compressed that day on Hacksaw Ridge into language suitable for public consumption. Corporal Doss repeatedly braved enemy fire to rescue wounded comrades, lowering them to safety and refusing to leave his position despite orders to withdraw. Clean sentences that captured tactical results without conveying the weight of 17 seconds when everything hung on hemp fibers and faith stretched beyond reasonable limits. Dr. Stevenson had written his own account for medical journals, focusing on the unprecedented nature of individual rescue operations conducted under sustained enemy fire. The doctor's report included precise casualty figures and evacuation times, noting that 9 seriously wounded soldiers had reached the aid station alive because one medic refused to accept tactical reality. But Stevenson's clinical language couldn't capture the sight of a lone figure appearing and disappearing in the smoke, always returning with another wounded man who shouldn't have survived the descent. Lieutenant Morrison had been promoted to captain and awarded his own Bronze Star for leadership during the Hacksaw Ridge assault. His after-action report mentioned Doss's actions in terms that balanced official recognition with implied criticism of a soldier who had exceeded orders and endangered himself unnecessarily. Morrison had never fully resolved his feelings about a medic who saved lives by ignoring direct commands, heroism that made effective military discipline nearly impossible. The men Doss had lowered to safety scattered across America after the war, carrying memories they rarely shared with family or friends. Williams returned to farming in Iowa with limited use of his left arm, but alive to plant crops and raise children. Martinez became a teacher in New Mexico, occasionally pausing during history lessons about World War II to remember spinning helplessly above Okinawan cliffs while machine gun fire sparked off coral around him. Chen opened a small restaurant in California, serving customers who never knew their meals were prepared by hands that had gripped canvas stretcher sides while mortars walked across a contested plateau. They stayed in touch through Christmas cards and occasional letters, bound by shared knowledge of a day when individual courage had intersected with systematic killing in ways that defied explanation. None spoke publicly about Hacksaw Ridge in specific terms, preferring to let official accounts carry the weight of testimony. But they remembered the sound of hemp rope creaking under stress, the careful timing required to move between machine gun bursts, and the voice calling from above that refused to abandon wounded soldiers regardless of tactical considerations. The rope itself had been collected by graves registration teams and disposed of according to standard procedures for damaged equipment. No one thought to preserve hemp fibers that had saved 9 lives, treating them as routine battlefield debris rather than artifacts of extraordinary action. But fragments remained embedded in Doss's memory with perfect clarity. The rough texture of hemp against torn palms, the way individual strands separated under stress, the 17 seconds when mathematics and faith had been tested beyond reasonable limits. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. In Rising Fawn, Georgia, rain continued falling on Doss's roof with the same sound that had preceded dawn assaults on fortified positions across the Pacific. His hands no longer trembled when handling rope, but he never forgot the weight of choices that had turned an ordinary morning into legend. The official citations would record his actions in language suitable for public inspiration, but the real story lived in 17 seconds when hemp fibers and faith had been stretched beyond breaking points and somehow held. The arithmetic had been simple. 9 men reached safety because one medic refused to accept retreat when wounded soldiers called for help. But the weight of that arithmetic would last lifetimes, carried in nightmares and phantom pain by a man who had learned that heroism felt indistinguishable from terror, when measured in separating rope fibers and prayers that asked for strength to get just one more. Outside his Georgia window, dawn broke over peaceful countryside, where the only ropes were clotheslines and the only heights were barn roofs. But memory held other landscapes, where individual conscience had intersected with systematic violence, where ordinary faith had been tested against extraordinary circumstances, and where the difference between salvation and catastrophe had been measured in 17 seconds of fraying hemp and desperate prayer. The legend would live in citations and ceremonies, but the man who created it would carry the real weight, the knowledge that courage and terror occupied the same space, that individual action could save lives without changing wars, and that heroism left scars invisible to everyone, except those who had counted hemp fibers, while other men's lives hung in the balance.